The lieutenants traded a single, knowing look. The no exceptions boss had found an exception. And in doing so, he had become something far more terrifying than a mobster. He was now a man with a grievance. As the engines of the black SUVs roared to life, Maxie looked back up at the third-floor window where a dim light flickered. He had spent years building a reputation as a monster. Tonight, for the first time, he was going to earn it for the right reasons. Rules were meant to be broken, he realized, but only if you were strong enough to survive the wreckage. The black SUVs sat idling, their exhausts huffing white plumes into the cooling night air. But Maxie didn't get in yet. He stood with one hand on the doorframe, his gaze drifting down the sidewalk. A few yards away, the man in the blue jacket, the same one who had scurried past Zola on the street earlier, was coming back from the corner bodega, clutching a plastic bag of groceries. When the man saw the fleet of dark vehicles and the grim, tattooed men adjusting their holsters, he didn't call for help. He didn't even stop. He simply tucked his chin into his collar, shifted his path to the very edge of the curb, and hurried into the shadows of the next building. Maxie watched the man disappear, a bitter taste rising in his throat. That blue jacket was the uniform of the city's soul, a shroud of practiced blindness. For years, Maxie had relied on that indifference. It was the silence of the blue jackets that allowed him to move his shipments and settle his scores without the interference of a prying public. He had always viewed it as a form of respect, a quiet acknowledgement of his power. But tonight, seeing it through the lens of Zola's tear-stained face, he realized it wasn't respect at all. It was a plague. The cost of the city's indifference was measured in the 3 floors of silence he had just descended. It was the price of a woman's breath, stolen by men like the Kossoff brothers because they knew the world would rather look at its feet than at a dying neighbor. The good citizens weren't the ones pulling the trigger or cutting off the oxygen, but their silence provided the darkness in which the scavengers worked. They paid their taxes and followed the laws. Yet they let a 6-year-old girl beg for her mother's life on a public corner as if she were a ghost. "Look at him," Maxie muttered, his voice barely audible over the low growl of the engines. Kenji stepped up beside him, following his gaze. "Who? The old guy? He's just a local boss. He knows better than to get involved." "That's the problem," Maxie replied, his fingers tightening on the car door until the metal groaned. "He knows better. Everyone knows better. The cops know better than to touch the Kossoff's legal paperwork. The doctors know better than to treat a patient who can't pay. Even we knew better than to care about a woman in a walk-up apartment." Maxie looked up at the flickering streetlights, feeling the weight of the $2 bill in his pocket. It felt heavier than the gold around his neck. That small piece of paper was the only thing in the entire district that wasn't covered in the dust of apathy. Zola hadn't learned to know better yet. She still believed that if you were hurting, you asked for help. She had seen the blue jackets passing her by and recognized them for what they were: hollow shells. She had seen Maxie, a man the world called a monster, and recognized something the others had lost: the ability to actually move. The true cost of indifference wasn't just the suffering of the poor. It was the way it turned everyone into a shadow. The man in the blue jacket wasn't a villain, but he was a ghost, haunting his own neighborhood, terrified of his own shadow. Maxie realized that for 15 years, he had been the king of a graveyard, ruling over people who were already dead inside because they had given up on the idea of justice. "He thinks he's safe because he minds his own business," Maxie said, finally stepping into the SUV. But the snake is eating his neighbors tonight. Tomorrow, the snake will be at his door. And there won't be anyone left to hear him scream. Maxie slammed the door, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the quiet street. He wasn't just going after the Kossoff brothers for the oxygen now. He was going after them because they were the ones who thrived in the silence that the blue jackets provided. He was going to make so much noise that the entire city would be forced to look up. He was done being a ghost. As the convoy pulled away from the curb, tires screeching against the asphalt, Maxie didn't look at the road ahead. He looked at the rearview mirror, watching the man in the blue jacket finally slip inside a doorway and bolt the lock. The city was a cold, indifferent machine. But tonight, Maxie was going to throw a wrench into the gears. The basement of the ironbound social club didn't smell like mercy. It smelled of gun oil, stale espresso, and the cold ozone of high-end electronics. Usually, when the war room was activated, the air was thick with the tension of a looming territory grab or a retaliatory strike. But as the 37 men of Maxie's inner circle gathered around the sprawling steel tactical table, the atmosphere was spiked with a confused, restless energy. They were the elite. Men who had seen the worst the city had to offer. And they were currently staring at a digital blueprint of a pharmaceutical distribution center. Maxie stood at the head of the table, his suit jacket discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dense tapestry of ink on his forearms. He didn't look like a man about to commit a crime. He looked like a general preparing for a siege. In the center of the table, pinned down by a heavy brass shell casing, sat the crumpled $2 bill. It was the most important piece of intelligence in the room. "We move at 0200, Maxie said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of his lieutenants. "The target is the Kossoff Medical Depot on 4th. It's a reinforced concrete structure with a dual redundancy security grid. They've got 6 armed guards on the perimeter and a biometric lock on the climate-controlled vault." Kenji leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "Boss, that's where they keep the high-end respiratory tech and the grade A antibiotics. It's basically a fortress for legal drugs. If we breach that, the sirens will trigger a city-wide response in under 4 minutes. Then we finish in 3, Maxie countered. He tapped a section of the blueprint. "Leo, you're on the breach. I want the back wall open, not the front door. We aren't here to trade lead with the guards unless they force our hand. We're here for the payload. And the payload is oxygen," one of the younger soldiers asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "We're risking a federal RICO case for air tanks and some liquid meds. Boss, the street is already whispering. They think we've lost our edge." Maxie leveled a gaze at the young man that made the air in the room feel 10 degrees colder. He walked slowly around the table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. "The street thinks our edge is our willingness to kill. They're wrong. Our edge is that we own this district. And when someone like Viktor Kossoff thinks he can move into my district and start pricing life out of the reach of children, he's telling the world that my name doesn't mean anything." He pointed to the $2 bill. "That's a contract. It's been signed. And the deposit has been paid? Tonight. We aren't mobsters. We are the only law that works. We aren't hitting this place for profit. We're hitting it for a woman named Imani who has 3 hours of life left if we don't act. We're hitting it because a 6-year-old girl thinks I'm the only man in this city who can keep his word." The room went silent. The mercy mission was no longer a joke or a distraction. Maxie had framed it as an act of ultimate dominance. To save a life in a city that wanted it gone was the loudest declaration of power he could make. The mechanic is prepping the thermal crates, Kenji announced. His voice now crisp and professional. The doubt gone? We've secured a private ambulance with blacked out plates. It'll follow the convoy. We've got 2 volunteers from the clinic on 8th. Doctors who owe us favors. They'll be ready to intubate as soon as we clear the perimeter. Maxi nodded. His jaw set like granite. He looked at the men around him. Hardened killers, thieves, and enforcers, and saw them beginning to stand a little straighter. They had spent their lives being feared, but for the first time, they were being mobilized to be necessary. Check your watches, Maxi ordered. No unnecessary casualties. But no delays. If a door doesn't open, take the wall. If a guard doesn't move, put him down. We bring that medicine back. Or we don't come back at all. As the men began to break away to check their weapons and load the SUVs, the ironbound mobilization took on a terrifying, rhythmic precision. This wasn't a hit. It was a reclaiming of the city's soul. Maxi picked up the $2 bill, folded it once, and tucked it back into his pocket. The no exceptions boss was about to show the Kossoff brothers that there was one rule he would never break. When you take a child's money, you finish the job. The industrial district was a graveyard of rusting machinery and shadows when the 3 black SUVs drifted into the alley behind the Kossoff Medical Depot. There were no sirens, no shouting, and no waste of motion. Maxi sat in the lead vehicle, his eyes fixed on the green phosphor glow of the tactical tablet in Kenji's hands. The building ahead was a fortress of glass and steel, guarded by men who thought their corporate badges and high-end security contracts made them untouchable. They were used to dealing with desperate addicts or small-time thieves. They had never faced the coordinated wrath of the ironbound syndicate. Kill the lights, Maxi commanded. The night swallowed the vehicles whole. 4 men, dressed in matte black tactical gear, slipped out of the side doors like ghosts. They didn't carry the heavy assault rifles used for territory wars. Tonight, they carried suppressed sidearms and high-tensile zip ties. This was a surgical extraction, not a massacre. Leo led the team toward the rear loading dock, his movements fluid and practiced. He reached the perimeter sensor and paused, waiting for the signal. In the back of the SUV, the syndicate's tech specialist tapped a final sequence into a rugged laptop. Looping the feed now, he whispered. The guards are watching a recording of an empty hallway. You have 6 minutes before the system runs a checksum. Maxi stepped out of the car. The gold chain around his neck tucked beneath his tactical vest, he moved with a heavy, predatory grace toward the back wall. He didn't wait for the door. Leo placed a series of specialized thermal breaching charges against the concrete. Not explosive, but chemical. With a muted hiss, the intense heat ate through the lock and the hinges like a hot knife through wax. The door didn't blow open. It simply ceased to be an obstacle. They moved inside with terrifying synchronization. 2 guards were stationed at the end of the first corridor, sipping coffee and staring at their phones. They didn't even have time to look up before they were swarmed. Leo and Kenji took them down in a blur of motion. Hands clamped over mouths, knees driven into midsections. Within seconds, the guards were bound and gagged behind a stack of shipping crates. Vault room ahead, Kenji whispered over the comms, 2 more on the door. Maxi led the way this time. As they rounded the corner, the 2 guards reached for their holsters. Seeing the massive, tattooed figure of the boss emerging from the dark, Maxi didn't fire. He closed the distance in 3 explosive strides, his fist connecting with the first guard's jaw with the sound of a falling tree. He caught the man before he hit the floor to muffle the sound, while Leo neutralized the second with a swift, precise strike to the temple. The vault door was a slab of brushed steel with a biometric scanner. Maxie stepped aside, allowing the mechanic to bypass the hardware. "It's a localized pressure seal," the mechanic muttered, his fingers flying across a handheld bypass device. Just a few more seconds. A soft thump echoed through the chamber, and the heavy door hissed open, venting a cloud of cold, sterile air. Inside, the shelves were lined with the very things the world had deemed too expensive for Zola's mother. Industrial-grade oxygen tanks, concentrated vials of rare antibiotics, and high-end nebulizers sat in neat, indifferent rows. To the Kossoff brothers, this was inventory. To Maxie, it was the breath of a dying woman. "Load it," Maxie ordered. His men didn't grab the cash box or the high street narcotics. They moved with a singular focus, lifting the heavy oxygen canisters and the thermal crates of medicine. They worked with the same urgency they would have used to steal millions. Yet they were carrying nothing but air and glass. As they retreated toward the exit, a distant alarm began to wail. A manual trigger from the front desk. "We're made," Kenji barked. "Security team is moving from the front gate." "Stay the course," Maxie said, his voice a calm anchor in the rising chaos. "Leo, get the payload to the ambulance." "Kenji, hold the hallway. Nobody gets past us." Maxie stood in the center of the loading bay, a dark silhouette against the flickering red emergency lights. He looked down at the $2 bill he had tucked into his glove for safekeeping. The job was halfway done. They had the medicine. Now they just had to fight their way back to the girl who was waiting in the dark. As the heavy boots of the Kossoff enforcers pounded toward them, the boss of the Ironbound Syndicate didn't retreat. He braced himself, a monster standing guard over a miracles. The sirens were a distant, fading wail against the silence of the Ironbound district as the black SUVs screeched to a halt in front of the crumbling tenement. The transition from the violent precision of the raid to the hollow stillness of the third floor hallway was jarring. Maxie led the way, his boots heavy on the stairs, followed closely by two men carrying the heavy oxygen canisters and a doctor whose face was pale, with the realization of whose favor he was finally returning. Inside the apartment, the air was dangerously thin. Zola was still there, a small shadow hunched beside the bed, her hand locked in her mother's limp grasp. She looked up as the door swung open, her eyes wide not with fear, but with a desperate, heartbreaking hope. She saw Maxie, the tattoos, the suit now dusted with concrete, and the gold chain gleaming in the dim light. And she knew. "Move," Maxie commanded, his voice a low, focused growl. The team moved with the same tactical speed they had used at the warehouse. Within seconds, the rhythmic hiss thump of the industrial oxygen concentrator began to pulse through the room. The doctor worked in silence, his hands steady as he administered the concentrated antibiotics and adjusted the mask over Imani's face. Maxie stood at the foot of the bed, his muscular frame silhouetted against the duct-taped window, watching the rise and fall of Imani's chest for several agonizing minutes. The only sound was the mechanical breathing of the machine and the quiet sobbing of the girl. Then, the miracle happened. The gray pallor of Imani's skin began to recede, replaced by a faint, ghostly flush of life. Her eyelids fluttered, then opened, her gaze wandering through the haze of medication until it landed on Zola. Zola, it was a whisper, but it was clear. No longer choked by the rattle of death, Zola let out a choked cry and buried her face in her mother's shoulder. The doctor checked his monitors and gave Maxie a brief, affirmative nod. She was stable. The system had tried to delete her, but the ironbound syndicate had written her back into the ledger. Maxie watched them for a long moment, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest, a sensation far more potent than the adrenaline of a territory war. He looked at the room, at the poverty and the neglect, and then at the two lives he had reached into the abyss to pull back. He had spent 15 years building a kingdom of fear. But tonight, he had built a sanctuary. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the $2 bill. It was torn, sweat-stained, and practically worthless by any standard of the world he lived in. He leaned over the small, chipped nightstand and placed the bill next to a glass of fresh water. Beside it, he laid a small piece of stationery from the Ironbound Social Club. In a sharp, authoritative hand, he had written 3 words. Paid in full. Maxie turned and signaled to his men to withdraw. He didn't wait for a thank you, and he didn't stay to explain who he was. As he walked toward the door, he felt the weight of the city again. The corruption of the Kosovs, the indifference of the Blue Jackets, and the laws that protected the greedy. But as he stepped out into the hallway, he felt lighter than he had in years. He reached the sidewalk just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the industrial skyline. The no exceptions boss was gone. In his place stood a man who finally understood that power wasn't measured by how much you could take, but by what you were willing to protect. Kenji was waiting by the car, holding the door open. The board is calling. Maxie. They want to know about the warehouse. Maxie looked up at the 3rd floor window one last time before sliding into the back seat. Tell them I was settling a debt, he said, his voice as steady as the morning tide. And tell them the Ironbound Syndicate has a new code. As the SUV pulled away, the $2 bill remained on the nightstand. A small, crumpled testament to the day a monster decided to become a saint.